what we've been doing the last couple of weeks is this quick detour on agape love and phileo love, trying to make sure that we understand what it is. And Walter and I had a nice conversation. It was in the airport coming back from New York last Sunday night, and Walter called. We talked for about an hour, I think, or somewhere around there. Do you want to share, if you can, just for a second, like what the last 2 weeks has brought up in your mind?
Well, when Steve started this whole thing, and
wasn't intentional.
Well, anyways, the topic was, but then my challenge to the question about the agape love and to how we apply that and what our enemies are and all that really caused a greater development and understanding of what that is. I know you've now learned more that you didn't know, and I'm learning more, but it caused a lot of other things now where my mind's turning different directions. But learning that how we apply the agape love, which is most often used, not 100%, but most often used in Scripture for love for one another as brothers and sisters, is not the same love we would apply to somebody who's not a believer. It's like the same thing as how you love your family is different than how you would love your stranger next door that you do not know. And so, and put that in context, because we are family, and we're united by the holy breath of God, and because of that, we have that special love. And because of that special love, we have something that by demonstrating that love, when Jesus says, "They will know you are my disciples for the love you have for one another," and as an application to us, that creates something that pagans, non-believers will see, that we have something special, because that special love we see with each other, it should cause them to want that, to desire that. But it also got me thinking about God and how he looks at people that are not believers, that are wicked, and about the hate, how he hates that. Even David says in Psalms how he hated God's enemies and wanted to hate God's enemies like God hates his enemies. Probably the exact quote. So it's got me really thinking a lot of things of understanding perspective, because for me, I was always ready just to love everybody. And no matter what, the reality is I should not be given that same kind of love I have for my brothers and sisters in Christ with somebody who's not. Especially if they're an enemy.
Let me ask a question based on what you said there. What is the danger or the implication of having this generic application of we're supposed to love everyone?
Universalism.
Yeah, you want to explain that for anyone who doesn't understand what that is?
It's basically like everybody is equal. Everybody, believes in God no matter where you come from, whether you believe in Buddha or Islam or whatever. It doesn't matter. We're all one love, one world, one religion. Essentially, is the concluding, effect. And if you just love everyone the same, then that's all you need to do.
And it would also
there's no sanctification. There's no separation.
That's right. That's right. And that's my point. If we are to love everybody regardless of their commitment and obedience and reverence for God, then it would completely negate Christ's own word. They will know you're my disciples by how you love one another. He didn't say the world will know you're my disciples, and by that he's referring to the unbelieving world. He didn't say they would know you're my disciples by how you love everyone regardless of whether they follow me. He didn't say that. It was clearly a mark of distinction and a mark of separation. So, in this whole discussion, we haven't even gotten to look at the dictionary type, or in the biblical world called the lexical definition of these words, which we're going to do today. But it struck me as we've been going through this process over the last couple of weeks, and knowing Walter's personality and knowing his evangelist heart, I can understand how what I said and what I believe the Bible is teaching us, how that would be difficult for him. Because his evangelist heart and his upbringing and his personality says, yes, you love everyone. but that's not actually what we're commanded. And I have to say it one more time because I want to make sure that nobody misunderstands me. When I say that we are not commanded to agape love everyone in that style, I'm not saying that we are to hate people who are not Christians. And we'll try to deal with the question of what is supposed to be our attitude towards people who are not Christians, right? I think last week Peter answered that question, right? Honor people, honor all people, love God, and respect the king. Yeah, go ahead.
I don't know, Walter, if you remember me saying that a couple of weeks ago, that if I had a choice to choose between Ebony, which is my daughter-in-law, and my daughter, which is an atheist, and I had to choose between them, as
The
far
daughter
as
she birthed.
y'all know Kabari.
Yeah.
But anyway, I had mentioned it, which I meant it, and which I think I told you, I told her, if I had to choose between the both of them, if I had to push someone off the cliff, I told my daughter I would have to push her. And that's my biological daughter. But Ebony is my spiritual daughter. Now that's how I take love as your the love in the spirit and love physically. Do you understand that? Like if Ebony needed something and my daughter needed something, and I was in a position I only could help one, I would have to have Ebony.
Yeah, and you know what? What your analogy is hinting around the edges of one of the key distinctions between agape love, which is that love that we're commanded to have for each other, and what's commonly defined as brotherly love. And again, we'll get to the specific definitions here in a second. Is choices involved, and it's choice based on something. And I would even go so far as to say is that this word agape that is translated love, both in the Old as well as the New Testament, like the Septuagint uses agape all the time. It's not primarily an emotion like we think of as emotions, right? But that's how we use the word in English all the time. I love you, and we're trying to say I have a certain kind of feeling for you, whether it is a brotherly love kind of feeling or the love between a husband and wife and romantic and that kind of stuff. But the Bible is, and going back to the conversation about Andy Stanley, one of the values of the Old Testament is to go back and trace the use of a word or a phrase over a very long period of historical time. You get very clear about what certain things mean when you look at how it's actually used, which is why I didn't jump to the definition right away. I didn't want to show you the definitions before I showed you a lot of the verses, how these words are used. And we'll take a look at a couple more now, but one of the key distinctions about this agape love is a choice, right? And let me not go any further on that because I'm just going to, get to the lexical definitions right away. If you remember last week, I used a couple of graphics to support my contention that we are commanded to deal with fellowship first, right? The command to love one another is about how we deal with each other within the fellowship. And the command to love your enemy, love your neighbor as yourself and love your enemy and not hate your enemy, brought up the question of who is your enemy. And my proposition was that based on the way it's presented in the Bible, an enemy is somebody within the fellowship who's not treating you correctly. It's not necessarily an enemy of the gospel, although someone who is not a Christian can treat you poorly as well. But the context of all of this stuff is fellowship first. And so I went back to Leviticus and we looked at how God kind of rolled out the temple and the priesthood and the service. And Jewish life focused in and around the temple, which is where the presence of God dwelt. And then it went out from there to the priesthood and out from there to the leaders of the tribes and then to the entire nation. And we see that concentric model very clearly. Well, I think when you're looking for it, it's clear that it's there. Like sometimes you don't know it's there until you start looking for it. But then I said that we take this idea of a concentric model and we apply that to the church as well, right? That within the context of life, like living in a world, like who is it that you are supposed to show deference to? Who do you choose to interact with? And, Vera in her example was saying, given a choice between my spiritual daughter and my atheistic, I mean, is she rejected Christ or is she more of an agnostic?
It's,
Don't know. Not sure.
I mean, she believes in a supreme being.
Okay.
But she doesn't believe in Jesus. That,
Yeah.
That God had a son.
Yeah, so between a believing daughter-in-law and an unbelieving genetic physical daughter, who do you choose to cherish and treasure? Right? And that's really the heart of agape, is it's actually making a choice. So it's about the core of who we are as people, how we order our lives, the decisions we make, the choices we make. It's got to focus around the faithful and the obedient. And if you notice, this is basically all of these circles represent the church world. And the core, the committed people who are faithful and obedient, basically represent the people, I was going to say are guaranteed to make it to the end, but that's not necessarily true. But the core of the fellowship, the decisions that we make about who we interact with, how we behave, is focused first and foremost between those obedient and faithful people. Beyond that, you have what I've called here the ignorant worldly Christians. And these are people who love God. They just maybe don't study diligently. They just don't know. Maybe it's the immature person. Like I'm 24 years old and I just became a Christian and I'm still living like the world because I don't know any different. And I think God has a lot of patience for those people, which means we should have patience for them too. But I, as a Christian, who I hope that I'm in that core group of faithful and obedient seekers, it doesn't mean I'm perfect, but it means I know who I am. I know my weaknesses. I'm actively searching more. I want to fill in the holes, and I'm moving forward. If I was given the choice, if two people came up to me and said, I need you to come help me move next weekend, and one is an ignorant worldly Christian, and the other one is a cognizant worldly Christian, meaning I'm making mistakes and I know, but I keep doing it because I like it, but I know I shouldn't, but I do it anyways. I would choose to give my assistance to the person who is ignorant of their mistakes versus the one who is aware but still does them anyways. Why? Because that's an expression of agape love. I'm choosing them because of their kind of how close they are to God. Does that concept make sense to you guys?
Yes.
And then on the outside, you've got the doubters, deniers, and the deceivers. And these are some of the descriptors that we see in some of the epistle later. And because there are people in the church who claim to be Christians who are just putting on a show. People who claim to be Christians, but they're not really convinced. And some people who are, actively trying to deceive other Christians. We see records of this, and throughout the New Testament, and warnings of a lot of these things in the writings of the early church. So the whole concept is fellowship first, and I think we have to look at words like agape or love from that perspective. Now, turn to Acts 13 for a second. I just want to show you an example that I think kind of supports this. And it doesn't necessarily in fact, it doesn't use the word love or agape or phileo, but it illustrates a concept. And this is Acts 13, verse 42. This is where Paul and Barnabas are out spreading the gospel. And you know what Paul's habit was, right? Paul would go into a town, a city. He would go to the temple first. He would present the gospel to the Jews, and only when they rejected his message would he go then preach the gospel to the Gentiles. So Acts 13:42 says, "So when the Jews went out of the synagogue, the Gentiles begged that these words might be preached to them the next Sabbath. Now when the congregation had broken up, many of the Jews and devout proselytes followed Paul and Barnabas, who, speaking to them, persuaded them to continue in the grace of God. On the next Sabbath, almost the whole city came together to hear the word of God, but when the Jews saw the multitudes, they were filled with envy, and contradicting and blaspheming, they opposed the things spoken to Paul." Now, in acting that way, they made themselves enemies of Paul. They were Jews just like Paul was. They were in the synagogue. Paul wasn't under the Mosaic law at this point, but they had, they were family in kind of that national sense, but because of the way they behaved against him, they made themselves his enemies. In verse 46, then Paul and Barnabas grew bold and said it was necessary that the word of God should be spoken to you first. But since you rejected and judge yourselves unworthy of everlasting life, behold, we turn to the Gentiles. For the Lord has commanded us, I have sent you as a light to the Gentiles, that you should be for salvation to the ends of the earth. And it goes on in the next couple of verses in 48 to 50 to talk about how the Gentiles were ecstatic that the gospel was being brought to them, that it wasn't just for Jewish people, that they could be part of God's program and have his grace and mercy as well. But notice verse 51. But they, being Paul and Barnabas, shook off the dust from their feet against them and came to Iconium. Now, does that sound like Paul was loving the people who rejected Christ? What does it mean to shake the dust off your feet?
Well, that's what Jesus told the other disciples to do too as well. If they don't receive you, shake the dust off your feet. Because that, he said, would be, Sodom and Gomorrah would favor better on Judgment Day than they did.
Yeah. I'm basically this idea of dusting, knocking the dust off your feet or whatever. It's basically saying, like, I'm done with you. It was kind of like what Pilate did when he crucified, when finally he capitulated to the Jews to crucify Christ. What did he do? He washed his hands in front of them, and he said, my hands are clean. This is all on you. He's absolving them of responsibility. And so if the command to love is something that we were to extend to all regardless of whether they committed to Christ, it would include those who actively reject him. And I would much rather follow the example of Paul, which basically says that if somebody has actively rejected Christ, even one of my own children, if they were antagonistic and hateful towards God or towards me because I am committed to God, then I'm not under any obligation to agape love them. In fact, I'm probably under an obligation to cause some degree of separation. Right? Does that make sense? Now, the counter argument to this would again be like, well, that's only for people who rejected Christ. And, maybe that is true. But, the basis of agape love, as I just kind of shared talking about Vera's story or her example, is that the basis of agape love is exalting the object of love above all things. And that means that we choose the fellowship, we choose fellow believers, and even within the church, we choose those who are actively committed, seeking moving forward, over those who are on the fringe, who are, kind of doubters and deceivers and deniers. It's about the prioritization. It's about that hierarchy. Yes, go ahead.
Exalting what?
The object of the love. And as I'll show with you in a second here, this is in essence the definition of agape. It's if you look up the word agape in any of the Greek language books, it talks about cherishing and treasuring something because of something that is part of that thing's or person's inherent nature. So why do we as Christians love God? Because he loved us first, and because he's gracious, and he's magnificent, and he's just. We love him, and it's a one-directional relationship in that sense because of what he's done for us. Like very clearly, we love him because he loved us first. And what I was saying earlier is that I would propose that, when you kind of take all these things together, agape love has nothing to do with how you feel.
Amen.
It is a choice that you make based on priorities. And that's one of the big distinctions between that and this phileo love, which again commonly interpreted as brotherly love, right? The agape love that we have for God is because of his love. And when we went back and we looked at John 3:16, for God so loved the world, and we looked at the language, and it's actually not about the magnitude of his emotion, it's about the action he took. For God loved us this way, he sent his son to die on a cross. It's not about how big his fuzzy emotions are, it's about the action that he took. It's about the action that he took, right? And for us, because we love him because he loved us first, we express our love in action through obedience.
Yes.
That's how we agape love God. And that's clear, like we see that a couple of times where Jesus said, if you love me, you will keep my word. You will obey me. If you say you love God and you hate your brother, you're a liar. If you say you love God and you're not obeying him, or at least seeking to be better in obedience, you either don't understand love or you're one of these guys. You're a doubter, a denier, or a deceiver. Now, because agape love is based on choice, what you choose to esteem and cherish above all other things, and it's action, what you do because of that prioritization. Agape love for the brethren, if agape love for God is obedience, it's expressed in obedience, how would you express agape love for Christian brothers and sisters? And what is it based on? Again, remember that agape love is prioritizing and cherishing something because of something that's inherent to that thing or person. How do we understand agape love? When Jesus says, by this they will know you're my disciples, the love, the agape you have for one another. How do we agape love the brethren? Like what is inherent in you guys that drives me to agape love you? Yeah.
To me, it's compassion and awareness and understanding of someone else's feelings and an expression of concern.
Okay.
I treasure how they feel and their relationship to me.
All right, so now you're talking about a bi-directional connection, which is actually part of the phileo side, right? And we kind of have to deal with this in layers. So let me go to Vera first before I come to you. Yeah.
The way, the way I have learned how to love, or the way that I believe God is teaching me to love, I look at myself first. And there are a lot of things that say that I desire other people would look beyond some of my faults. I can't say that word, good, fault.
Faults.
Whatever.
Yeah.
But, and then I say, now, if a person, this is really how I look at it, if a person can love me with the way that I am, and understand me with the way that I am, and I feel that causes me to want to love other people. Because if I think God can love me with my shortcomings, then I feel that I ought to be able to love as well. And I mean, this is how I really am able to practice it.
Mm-hmm.
It's really like that. It's because of my own problems, faults, characters, thinking, thoughts, biases, and all of it. I learned from all of that to love other people. So
define what you mean by loving other people.
I'm not as critical. I'm not quick to judge.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than to judge, I'd rather try to understand.
So you're talking about patience?
Yeah. Say for instance, if because one time I saw a little boy, he was running through the hospital, and it just grieved my heart to death. And I saw the mother, she seemed like she didn't know how to respond to the child. And I grieved for the child, but then I realized that it was probably she's raising the child because of the way she had been raised. Mm-hmm. And so rather than to criticize her, I thought about her situation. And then it made me be more compassionate to her rather than to judge her for being a rotten, low down, no good mother. It made me think a little bit deeper. Right. I look more at, now I look, God, and I really do believe God has blessed me to look at more of why a person or people react or respond.
Right. So let me point something out. I'll come to you, Walter. When I said, how is it we express agape love for our Christian brothers and sisters, you both went to emotion.
Okay.
But that's the way that we, in our society, define love, and we just kind of go back to our default. And I'll try to clarify here in a second, Walter.
I look at it as looking how God shared his love. He demonstrated his love through Christ in his sacrifice for us. That kind of love is a kind of love that we are to have for one another.
We still haven't defined love.
It is
See, this is hard, isn't it? This is not easy.
Love is a choice to put someone else before yourself, to put their feelings, to put their life, and to sacrifice your life for them. For no greater love is this, that a man lay down his life for his friend.
All right, so now we're starting to get the heart of it. And you started with, it's a choice. And this is it an obligation?
Yeah.
Yes, it is,
Yeah.
because we're commanded by
But
Christ
it's not a choice,
to
is what I'm
love.
saying.
Well, but we're commanded to make the choice.
Okay.
Whether we do or not is different, and that's up to us.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But even, just give me one, and I know you want to chime in here. Back in Leviticus 18:19, right, when in the New Testament he quoted Leviticus, he said, love your neighbor as yourself. Ignoring what neighbor and all that kind of stuff means. I mean, what does that mean?
Denying yourself.
Yeah, so this is where we get to the heart of it. So let me rephrase the question or state it again. If we agape love God because he agape loved us first, and it was in the form of sending his son to die on the cross to be the atonement for our sins, and we treasure God because of that, because of his inherent nature that he is who he is. If we understand it's a choice that above all the things that we could choose to revere and cherish, we choose God. Why? Because he chose us first through his son. So how do we take that concept and apply it to agape loving our brothers and sisters? It's not about how we feel about them. It's something inherent to our brothers and sisters that drives us to choose them over everybody else. Whether it is choosing the people of my local fellowship versus people in some other fellowship that I've never met before, or whether it's choosing people in my fellowship versus non-saved people. It's about a choice to cherish and treasure you guys above everybody else because God agape loved you too, and you agape love him.
And the piggyback back to continue is that part of all that love is bestowing the same kind of grace that God has bestowed upon us. When we love one another, we're also being gracious with one another. We're giving that kind of grace, mercy, those things. I think that's all part of it.
Yeah. Ultimately, if agape loving God is obedience, agape loving the brothers and sisters is humility, which is what you were getting at. No greater love has a man than this, that he lays down his life. And this is really the essence of when God said in Leviticus, he says, love your neighbor as yourself. Man's inherent nature is to be selfish and to prioritize their own needs above everybody else. Me, 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 me.
Yes.
When he commanded, love your neighbor as yourself, he was saying, you have to prioritize them the way that you would prioritize yourself. And it should be automatic. But it's based on something that's inherent. And what's inherent with all of us is the unity of our faith and our commitment to God. So I am making choices to prioritize you people above all people because of our shared connection, because we are united in fellowship. Sorry, I kind of danced around your question. Go ahead.
I didn't think our voice. It wasn't a question. It was just I was just thinking about those men who just got released from North Korea, and knowing that I think all of them were Christians, and the great risk to themselves to go into such hostile territory, knowing that they were what they were probably going to face, but they did it so they could share the gospel with these people, and I just think. That's, because it's kind of hard to imagine that laying down your life for each other. I mean, we could say we would do it, but we've never in this cushy life been faced with that. But I just think of, they really did it.
Yeah.
They really did it.
If agape love with God is expressed in obedience, and agape love to brothers and sisters is expressed in humility, then it is impossible for us to agape love non-Christians who are disobedient to God and who are not humble with the brethren. It is impossible. Does that make sense to you guys?
Yes.
Yes? No? Oh, you're talking to the baby. I heard no. I'm like, okay, let's go over it again. Right? Now, I think Vera said, you talked about compassion, right? And compassion, what's that?
But it's coming through my own, when I say compassion, it's coming through my own thoughts and sinful habits and sinful thoughts and simple, I'm learning now through my own shortcomings. I don't know if that makes any sense or not.
Well, I think it's maturity, right?
I'm learning through my own personal shortcomings how people have had to be patient with me.
Mm-hmm.
Or, like my kids sometimes have to be patient with me. But what I'm saying is I'm learning now to be more thoughtful and more considerate and not so much concerned about my own personal feelings and my own personal thoughts. That's why I'm saying I'm learning how to love from my own errors in my own life. I don't know if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I'm not
and this
learning
is
from other people. I'm learning from my own errors. With it, God is opening up my eyes to see. Because I asked him, I really want to love people. The more I really want to love people, the more I hate myself.
Right. So here's the question. Here's the question. If I say that agape love cannot apply outside of the brotherhood and the sisterhood, right, outside the fellowship, if it cannot because of the nature of, basically the definition of the word and the basis of agape love.
I believe that.
All right. If we can't do that, does that mean that we should not have mercy and compassion on unbelievers?
No.
Of course not. And so what that means is that mercy and compassion are not synonymous with love, especially agape love.
Yeah.
Right? I can have compassion on a militant atheist who's fallen down and broken their leg.
Yeah.
Right? I can have compassion on that person, but expressing compassion to that person is not agape love.
I think agape love is not being selfish. I think agape love is that you begin to deny your own self, and you will be willing to let your thoughts of what you believe go in order to understand somebody else. I don't know. I'm not very good with words. Y'all can tell by the way I write.
That's part of that humility that we're talking about, right?
But I think it's just agape love begins to not think about yourself so much and your feelings. You always kind of want to watch out for the other person.
Yes. Go to Luke chapter 10. I want to look at the Good Samaritan here for a second because I know that this, this question of who is my neighbor and all that kind of stuff kind of crops up with the Good Samaritan story.
Can I ask a question? Yeah. If a atheist should ask you for a favor and you're able to do it, is it permissible to do it?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Especially if it doesn't contradict your, morality and your ethics and God.
I kept my daughter's kids
Yeah.
while she went on vacation.
But if you listen, you've got an atheist and a faithful brother or sister who ask you the same favor at the same time. Who do you choose?
Then I would have to do.
Right, and that's an expression of agape, right?
Okay.
That you are prioritizing your faithful brother and sister because that's what we're commanded to do.
I got one more question.
Sure.
This is family matters here. Isaac, Saban is having a surprise birthday party for Isaac. He's going to be 30. And Kabari is going. But some of the family members are not going to go.
Because Kabari's going?
Because Kabari's going to be there. And because they said we're not to fellowship with non-believers.
Where does it say that?
Or we're not to eat with them, or whatever.
Well, no. I mean, we're told in Corinthians not to eat with someone who claims to be a brother who's engaged in sexual immorality. In fact, Paul says, I don't mean unbelievers because then you'd have to be alone in the world because everyone's a sinner, right? So.
But anyway, we do have that problem.
I think there's an error there. I think
Okay.
there's an error there. Good.
But at least I'm right, because I'm
What's that?
to his birthday.
How do you explain it?
Yeah, where's the error?
The Can we deal with this afterwards?
Sure.
Because I think it's going to get me derailed, and I would really like to put the whole
Well, I
Agape
just want
discussion to
I
rest
was
today.
okay to go to Isaac's
Yeah.
birthday.
Yeah, I
Okay.
don't-
Which,
I
by
don't
the
see
way, they
anything
say
wrong
hi
with that.
to everybody.
They do.
Yes, Mom.
Awesome.
Hi.
All right, so the story of the New Samaritan, right? This is, I think, another spot where Jesus is clarifying and refining his disciples' understanding of things that the Jews in general thought that they understood. You remember, I think it was last session, might have been the one before, we talked about how the Hebrew word for neighbor strongly implies either directly or indirectly a countryman. Right, so a neighbor is not necessarily just someone who lives next door to you, even though we kind of use it that way. My next door neighbor is specific. My neighbor could be somebody who's in my community, like a couple of 100 square yards or something like that. But it just implies countryman, right? That's really the base implication. So verse 25, you guys know that the Samaritans were half Jews, right?
Yes.
So they were considered by the Jews to be just as bad as all the pagans because they had polluted their Jewish bloodline. So verse 25, and behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tested him, being Jesus, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? He said to him, What's written in the law? What is your reading of it? So he answered and said, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And he's quoting that part of Leviticus we've been talking about. And he said to him, You have answered rightly, do this and you will live. But he, wanting to justify himself, said to Jesus, Who is my neighbor? So you're to love your neighbor as yourself. Who is your neighbor? So then Jesus answered and said, A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, fell among thieves, who stripped him of his clothing, wounded him, and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance, a certain priest, and this is a Jewish priest, came down that road, and when he saw him, he passed on the other side. Now, the person in the parable who got mugged and left for dead is a Christian. I'm sorry, not a Christian. He's a Jew. And here we have a Jewish priest coming along, seeing this guy beaten and left for dead, and he leaves him alone. Presumably he had something better to do. But likewise a Levite, also a priest, when he arrived at the place, came and looked, and he passed by on the other side. But a certain Samaritan, and again, the point of the story using a Samaritan is to point out that, hey, you guys consider these people to be dogs. Like these are just as bad as Gentiles and pagans. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He had compassion. Now, what is compassion, first of all? Is it an action? Is it an emotion?
It's an emotion.
It's an emotion, right? In fact, the root word literally refers to your bowels. It's like being moved in your inner parts. Moved in your inner parts. So when he saw him, he was moved in his inner parts. So he went to him and bandaged his wounds. And so now, because of this spontaneous emotion, he goes and he takes action. He bandaged his wounds, poured oil on wine, and he set him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, took care of him. On the next day when he departed, he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I come again, I will repay you. Then he asked the question, So which of these do you think was neighbor to him who fell among the thieves? And he said, He who showed mercy, he who acted with mercy, was the one who was neighbor. Now that's kind of clunky English, right? Who was neighbor to him? Is Jesus defining, is he giving us a definition of neighbor? Because the guy said, Who's my neighbor?
Yeah, yes.
Is he saying this is the definition of neighbor?
I think so.
You would think so, right? But, again, English translation sometimes
Isn't it like,
gives you the wrong impression.
Isn't it supposed to be like who is neighborly?
That's exactly it, because the word is not a noun, right? If you just say who was his neighbor, of the 3 people, like 2 guys went by and they were supposed to stop because they were Jews.
Yeah.
The one who shouldn't have cared, he's the one who stopped and helped this guy out. He was moved with compassion. He acted with mercy. He's not defining what a neighbor is. He said, what does the action look like? And in fact, it's an adverb, so the better translation would be, who was neighborly to this man? It's the one who was moved with compassion and acted in mercy.
Yes.
Even though from a cultural standpoint,
Right.
those people just didn't do those things. Now, my point is this, is that what the Samaritan did for that Jewish man was not agape love. He was spontaneously moved with emotion and acted with mercy. And that falls in the realm of phileo rather than agape, because phileo is rooted predominantly in emotion, whereas agape is rooted in choice. And phileo is rooted in typically spontaneous type emotion. And it doesn't mean spontaneous like in an instant, although that can happen in a circumstance like this. Now, what this starts to do is to tease around the edges. So let's take a look at some of these definitions, and I think hopefully at the end we'll have some pretty good clarity about all this. So these are the many sides of phileo love, and all of these Greek words can be used as nouns. They can be used as verbs, adjectives, adverbs. So the word phileo as a noun can mean things like philanthropy. It can mean hospitality. It can mean friend. It can mean love in terms of the emotional stuff. And I'm not talking about the erotic love of eros. I'm talking about just emotional type love. And it can also be used for the word beloved. Like if I say Kathy is my beloved, if I said that in Greek, I would use phileo, or a noun version of that, philos. But it also means love, friend. Right? Now, we often define phileo as brotherly love, but actually that's not necessarily true. To say brotherly love, you have to use a compound word like Philadelphia, which is phileo or philos adelphos, love of brother. So phileo is not by itself synonymous with brotherly love, even though we tend to define it that way. It can also be used as an adjective, and it takes variable forms. So we could use this root word philos, turn it into an adjective, and we could describe someone as being philanthropic. He's very generous, would be another way to say it. But think about the word philanthropic. Can you see two root words in there? You can see philos. And what is anthropos? Anybody know? What is anthropology? It's the study of civilization, study of man. So philanthropic is love of mankind. And people who are philanthropists, what are they characterized by? Charities and foundations and giving money to bring water to the, some Africans or whatever, right? That is philanthropy. It can also be used to describe someone as being hospitable, or again, to be being beloved, or someone being friendly, or someone who is caring. And that's really kind of the essence of the philos group, is there's this emotion. Philanthropists are moved emotionally to act mercifully to people they don't even know, because they want to do good for people that they have no connection with. But they're moved by the human condition. Does that make sense? Right? And then the verb version of philos is phileo, and that has a wide range of meanings. It can mean to aspire. It can mean to enjoy, to care, and it can actually be used for kiss or embrace. When Paul says, greet each other with a holy kiss, that word kiss is phileo. Or when Paul he called elders together and he said, hey, listen, you're not going to see me anymore, and I got to go away. And the scripture says that everyone kind of like hugged on him, and they were crying and all that kind of stuff. They were embracing him. The word there is phileo. It can also mean to love and have this emotion based on the value of the interpersonal relationship. And that's where phileo really diverges from agape, because agape is not an emotional connection. It's a choice based on something that's inherent in the thing or the person or the object of your agape love. Whereas the phileo love is an emotion, it's an emotional connection that goes both ways. And I can talk about my phileo love with all of you guys. And I have more phileo love with some of you than others because I have a closer interpersonal connection with some of you guys compared to others. Are you guys tracking with me so far?
So you can do both.
You can do both, and I'll show
Within
you.
a fellowship, you can
Absolutely.
phileo and agape.
And I would be concerned if you had somebody in your close fellowship that you did not have phileo love for, because it's very hard to sit here and to see people pouring out their hearts and crying in front of 10 other people, and week after week hearing about the struggles and the victories and the praise and the prayer and just hanging out. It's hard not to develop phileo love, and I think this is part of the point of fellowship. What binds us together? Many different things, but part of it is the phileo love that we develop because we are connected through the agape love. And what is the agape love based on among the brethren? I choose you because you chose God and He died for you too. Question so far?
Jesus and John's relationship was it seemed as though it was a lot more knit and close than in comparison to
Yeah, he was the one that Jesus loved. Absolutely. So that's some of the sides of phileo. So just to kind of reiterate, it's a spontaneous emotion that just develops. It's not a choice. I have grown to love Walter in this way because we've been working side by side for 10 years? Something like that? That happened. I didn't have to choose it. It developed over time because we are like-minded and we're committed and we've just been hanging out for 10 years, working in the ministry. And I don't have that kind of love with someone I've never met, although I may have a connection with somebody. And if I, connected with somebody and we had similar morals and values, and let's say I met a Newfoundlander and we hung out for a while. The more we hung out, the more we got to know each other, the more we realized we had shared interests and all that kind of stuff. I would grow this brotherly kind of love for someone that I had just met. Go to John 11:1. The phileo love is more about an emotional attachment, whereas agape is the choice. John 11:1. Now a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the town of Mary and her sister Martha. It was that Mary who anointed the Lord with fragrant oil and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. Therefore the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom you phileo love is sick. They're appealing to his emotional connection to Lazarus. Skip down to verse 32. Because Jesus talks to his disciples, and I'm not going. All of a sudden he's like, all right, let's go. I think he was waiting for him to die, quite honestly. Verse 32, then Mary, when Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she fell down at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died, right? Because Jesus delayed, Lazarus died. He was already in the tomb. Therefore, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her weeping, he groaned in his spirit and was troubled. Why? Because of his phileo love for Lazarus, and because of the pain that they were in, because he loved Mary and Martha too. And they were hurting, and Jesus was hurting because they were hurting. Verse 34, and he said, where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. And then he says, Jesus wept. Shortest verse in the whole Bible. 2 words, Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him. And that's the phileo love. It's not agape. It's the emotional connection because they were brothers. Action driven by caring and concern for others is rooted in phileo love. Let me show you a couple of verses where kiss or embrace. Actually, you know what? Let me skip that because if you want to write these down, 2 Corinthians 13, 11, and 12. This is where Paul says to greet one another with a holy kiss. That concept and that command shows up a few times in Paul's writings. Matthew 26, 48. When Jesus was betrayed by Judas in the garden, remember what Judas did? He kissed him. That's phileo, the word phileo. Basically came up and embraced him and kissed him. And that was the sign of betrayal. We also know that phileo is not necessarily connected to love of God. And I say not necessarily, I'll clarify that in a second. Whereas agape love between us and God and us and each other demands a connection with God. It has to be, because that's what unites us. You can phileo love someone who's not a Christian. I love my mother and father, but they're not Christians. I don't agape love them because I choose you over them. I phileo love them because I'm their son and they're my mom and dad. And I have that emotional connection with them. So Matthew 10, verse 37. Jesus says, he who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And this is phileo. So phileo love is not necessarily based on any connection with the Lord. It is okay to phileo love people who are not Christians. But if you can't agape love them, it's impossible because we choose people who are committed Christians.
Yes.
Okay? You seeing the clarity? Also, none of the commands to love use the word phileo. None of them. They all use agape. Every single one of them. Here's a surprising use of the word phileo. This is John 5:20. For the Father loves the Son and shows him all things that he himself does, and he will show him greater works than these that you may marvel. Did you know that the Father has an emotional connection to his Son? That should make sense. I'd be very surprised if God did not have a phileo love of Christ. I'd be very surprised. Well, we don't necessarily think of God loving in that way because we tend to think of him in loving in this big grand agape love that we, I think, have misinterpreted. Now, let's talk about agape. Try to make this fairly quick here. So, as a noun, agape is again translated as love. As an adjective, it shows up in variable forms, including things like beloved. But this is, again, the crux of it. The verb agape or agapao, agape is actually the noun, but agapao, it's to cherish, to esteem, to hold in the highest regard. And that is different than the emotion that you see with these human interaction, connection, relationships that we're talking about. And as I've said several times, it's to love or to cherish, to choose something based on something that's inherent in the object of love, rather than the spontaneous connection that you get on a human plane. Now, can we love God in a phileo sense?
I do.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, yeah, we can because I do. I like that. Now, I don't see any, and there may be, right? There's a lot of verses that use the words agape and phileo. I have not come across any verse that uses the word phileo in the context of our love for God.
Even David?
Maybe. That would entail going back through the entire Septuagint, which is a big ordeal. But that's so Old Covenant. Yeah, after the Andy Stanley thing, I just ripped out my Old Testament and threw it away. Yeah, so I'm not saying that we cannot. In fact, I do believe we can. I just don't have proof of it because I haven't looked for that specifically. 1 John 3, verse 10. Remember, we're talking about agapao now, or agape love. 1 John 3:10. In this the children of God and the children of the devil are manifest. Whoever does not practice righteousness is not of God, nor is he who does not agape love his brother. For this is the message that you heard from the beginning, that we should agape love one another. Not as Cain, who was of the wicked and won and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his works were evil and his brother's righteous. Verse 14. We know that we have passed from life to death. Now, this is a mark of the distinction of having access now to the eternal life. We know that we have passed from death to life because we love, agape love the brethren. He who does not agape love his brother abides in death. When you are faced with a choice to cherish and prioritize believers versus unbelievers, The command is very clear. You pick the brethren. Doesn't matter how you feel. Doesn't matter how you feel. You are commanded to pick the brethren. Verse 16. By this we know love, because he laid down his life for us, and we also ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. Verse 18. My little children, let us not love in word or in tongue, but in deed and in truth. You know, one of the things about the phileo-style love is that the spontaneous emotional connection makes you want to do things for people. Right? In Vera's example, she saw a mother with a kid and went, man, that was me. Someone was patient with me. Let me be patient with them. That was an expression of phileo love. That was the compassion. That was that spontaneous emotion that you're being moved from within. But when it says here, we don't agape love in word or tongue, but in deed and in truth. And again, agape love, here's the example. If you say that you love God and you don't obey him, you don't love God. Because that is what agape love is. If you say you love God and you don't humble yourself to your brothers and sisters and it's all about you and not about them, you are lying. You don't love them. Because that is the definition of agape love of the brethren. It's the action that's driven by the choice, which is driven by the inherent nature of that person because they're a child of God.
Yes.
And they have made the same choice that you are. They're on the same path that you are. And they made the same journey and they're under the same renovation that you are. Verse 23.
Steve?
Yeah.
So that raises a question for me. So even whenever we are doing the brotherly love, the agape love towards a fellow believer, what if they're asking or wanting us to do something that is what you feel is not right?
What do you think? Because you still have to answer to God.
Right.
So you're not commanded to ignore your own ethics and morality, your obedience to God,
Right.
just because someone says or are a committed Christian, but they're asking you something you shouldn't or know you shouldn't do. Right? So if you are choosing between humbling yourself to a brother or sister, if that is contradictory to your agape love and obedience to God, you don't do it. And that's part of your conviction and your faith, right? Verse 23. And this is his commandment, that we should believe on the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another as he gave us commandment. You know, the more that I see these words and I look at the language and I compare the agape to the phileo and the context in which they're used, it's becoming very clear to me how powerful a command this is. Let me show you a couple of other things here and we'll try to clean this up. So again, a conscious choice to cherish and value something or someone because of some intrinsic value of the object or person of love. Action driven by appreciation or esteem, independent of your emotions or feelings. Not specific to God and or Christians. And all of the commands to love use agape and are confined to loving God and loving the brother.
So we can show something else in our life that has nothing to do with God, like a false God in our life, agape love.
Yeah, remember in
higher than what we would assume God, would that not be?
that would just be wrong.
Right.
Right. We are one of the distinctions in John 3, I think it's 19, talks about Christ coming into the world to bring light, but men loved darkness or loved darkness rather than light. That's agape love, right? Can Christians erroneously and incorrectly give agape love and cherish and treasure things that are not God? Yeah. I mean, what does Jesus say? Don't lay up for yourselves. Yeah. Lay up treasures in heaven, right? So, right. So why do you think God gave the command, or Jesus gave the command to love God through obedience and love each other through humility? The command is there because it's not natural to us.
No, it isn't.
It's a skill.
Yes.
It's a choice, right? And that's, again, it's the choice. The phileo stuff is spontaneous. You can't help hanging around good people just to start caring for them. You can't help it. It happens. You can choose to act as if you do, and sometimes the action first and then that phileo stuff comes later. 1 Thessalonians 4:9. This is starting to look at this idea now of agape actually includes phileo. Like I was trying to say, that when you start hanging out with people who love God the way that you love God, and you hear their hearts, you share their burdens, and they do the same thing for you, phileo love happens naturally. But that does not mean you cannot phileo love someone who's not a Christian, because that's spontaneous interpersonal connections and emotion. 1 Thessalonians 4:9. But concerning brotherly love, and that's the adelphos, you have no need that I should write to you, for you yourselves are taught by God to love one another.
Yes.
And indeed you do so toward all the brethren who are in Macedonia. But we urge you, brethren, that you increase more and more, that you aspire to lead a quiet life, to mind your own business, to work with your own hands as we commanded you, that you may walk properly towards those who are outside. So we are commanded to love God through obedience, to agape love each other through humility. We have this natural, spontaneous connection with each other, this emotional tie, because we're all in this together, but we have phileo-style love for other people who are not Christians because of our relationships with them. But what are we, if we are not commanded to agape love non-Christians, how are we to behave with them? Again, I'm not saying we go hate them. What does this say right here? Well, it doesn't say here, but in verse 12, walk properly towards those who are outside.
Yes.
And the Greek literally refers to decorous behavior. Be kind, be courteous. Like Peter said, honor all people, be respectful. Right? If you ever wonder about how to behave and react to someone who's a non-Christian who is not treating you well, guess what? Be respectful and kind. Because when they see you, they see God.
Amen.
So even though we're not commanded to love them, we are commanded to act with decorum, to honor people just because they're people. And it says, Paul says here, he says, you walk properly towards those who are outside so that you may lack nothing.
Yes.
God is watching how we as Christians treat non-Christians.
Amen.
We are not to be antagonistic to them, although I do believe that there is a line. That when someone becomes a militant, angry atheist, that's when Psalm 139 kicks in. When David said, I hate your enemies with perfect hatred. All right, a couple of takeaways. Philos simply means an emotional kind of love we most often express as caring and fondness. It's not specific to brotherly love unless that's actually what the language says. Philos can be applied on multiple scales, can have different objects. Remember 2 Peter, I went through this a couple of years ago in a lesson. Peter says in 2 Peter 1:5, but also for this very reason, giving all diligence, add to your faith virtue, to virtue knowledge, to knowledge self-control, self-control perseverance, to perseverance godliness, to godliness brotherly kindness, which is Philadelphia, and to Philadelphia add agape. They are clearly not synonymous. But we are to strive. And notice that Peter is giving us a progression. You start with diligence, faith, virtue, knowledge, self-control, perseverance, godliness, brotherly love, and then it's the agape. The agape is the ultimate end goal, to consistently and repeatedly choose God's people because he chose them, they chose him, and you choose each other. Now, I've got a couple of other things, but I don't want to take up too much time because we're already a little bit over an hour. But I'll leave this up here for a second if you guys want to just take a look at that. You know, there are different things that the Bible says that you can love. You can Phileo love, or I guess I have it up there. Philotheos is that emotional love of God. So it is in the Bible. My apologies. You can love money, you can love pleasure, you can love yourself, you can love your brothers and sisters, and you can love humanity in general. Big scale, lots of different objects of love, but the agape love is restricted to the brotherhood and to God. All right, any final questions?
I think we've all demonstrated agape love in the choice we've made. It's being here tonight. And that is, I have brothers who are pastors. I know they love God.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that we're supposed to worship in spirit and truth, and God's word is truth, the Bible says. And when that doesn't match what I see and hear, then it's hard for me to come alongside them and encourage them, and iron sharpening iron, and say, "Atta-way, you're doing what you should."
Yeah.
But Judy and I can get in a car and come here and do that.
Yeah.
Because we choose to do this.
Yeah.
And most of us have had an awkward moment because of the choice we made, because somebody else is going, "You do? You go all the way there? You do that?" Yeah, because we choose this. And I think the fact that we're here worshiping God with each other is a choice that was agape love.
Yeah, I agree. Let me put this in perspective, because again, we spent 3 weeks now looking at this concept, and initially to me it seemed like a detour and a departure from what this series on drawing nearer to God is all about. But as the more I thought about it, it's not, because the whole series of drawing nearer to God is about disciplines. It's about the things that we do as disciples of Christ that cause us to draw nearer to Him. And guess what? One of it is understanding this concept of agape love and choosing to be obedient to God and humble with each other. That is a Christian discipline, because you have to practice it. It might be a little bit more natural to some people than others, but none of us are where we should be. Now, here's the final question. Why does God even care about this stuff? Like, why is it important for us to understand these distinctions between agape and phileo and then start practicing it, even if it means that we say no to the unbelieving family or the uncommitted Christian parts of our family, and we prefer and choose the committed fellowship? Why is it important for us to start making those distinctions in our lives now?
Because that's what it's going to be in the kingdom.
That is, in the kingdom, the kingdom, there's going to be some mortals. But we just talked in our Bereans discussion.
The sanctification, the separation.
It's that separation, absolutely. But what is the whole point of practicing things and discipline?
It's to show
To
them
get us through.
So the world.
Yeah, Kyle's getting towards it.
Becoming kings and priests. We're supposed to be preparing for it.
Yeah, well, that's it. It's a training program, right? It's a training program. And we just talked in our Bereans class about the sixth seal and the day of the Lord, the sixth seal.
Okay.
There is coming a time where everything out in the world is going to get nasty, and everyone will have to choose. If you are not used to choosing,
That's true.
if you're not used to choosing the fellowship and God in your life
That's
now,
true.
how are you, if you don't practice it now, how are you going to be in
That's so
10 years?
true.
When it becomes really important for you to go, I choose God, I choose the fellowship.
That's
And it's, not to use a preachy word, but sanctification is being set apart,
Mhm.
choosing to be holy because God's holy and be more like His character.
That's right.
And by showing agape love, we create hopefully a hunger and a thirst for the non-believers to see that kind of love.
And that was Christ's point.
Yes.
Why are you guys different? Why are you different?
So when you love your enemies as agape love, and those could be like, is that right?
Yes, but remember the enemy in the context is a
Okay.
Christian who's not treating you properly.
So that would be like if you were like all Christians, but you didn't actually jive with somebody, they annoyed you for whatever reason.
No, if you go back to Leviticus, the verses that follow that have to do with not exacting vengeance. Right? And in fact, it says that you are to love your enemy because you don't want a root of bitterness to come up in your heart and then cause you to sin.
Right.
So loving your enemy is humbling yourself. When someone who is in your fellowship calls themselves a Christian brother or sister, they're not treating you well, you are not to go after them and to return in kind. You are to humble yourself, because that's the expression of agape love for the brethren. And you're patient with them because they're working out their salvation just like you are, and maybe they're not where you are.
Amen.
Now, if it comes down to the point where they don't stop, they don't repent, that's different, and we have biblical guidelines on how to deal with that. You take a brother or a sister and you go talk to them. And if they don't respond to you, then you take that to the leadership, right? So God's got this system all worked out for us, and He put it in His scriptures.
Okay, so I have never met anyone other than been on video
Yep.
in the Peoria Fellowship, but I agape love those people.
Yes.
And if I have a choice to do something for someone versus anyone in that fellowship I've never met, I choose the fellowship. And obviously, same here, but I develop phileo love for the people here because
Right, and you may not
because
have...
of feeling. I have agape love first, and then I can develop the phileo. And if I meet the people up there, I could also develop that with those people.
Right, because
Chances
that's about
are
that
good.
interpersonal connection and the emotionality
And
that
chances are good if I took that group of people, I could do that because we have so much in common.
Right.
Versus taking a group outside somewhere.
Right.
Okay, I just want to make sure
Yep.
I had it right.
Now, here we are going even further down the road.
Sorry.
It doesn't mean, like, let's say that you meet someone who you don't know is a Christian, and you develop a relationship and you have a phileo connection with them, and then you realize you're both brothers and sisters. Now you kick in the agape. So agape drives phileo emotionality when you have interpersonal relationships. You can have that interpersonal relationship with another Christian without knowing that they're still part of their family. Right? But I think as a general rule for us, agape begins first.
Which is really why you should honor and cherish and esteem
Yeah.
your relationship with other people, because you don't really know whether they are.
Yeah. You guys are a great example. Like, you showed up on our doorstep a few months ago.
And you didn't know whether you'd like us or not.
Well, we didn't have a connection, right? You were just like people who Joe sent me an email. You guys showed up a couple of weeks later.
You fed us and we keep coming back.
That's right. And you're like the bad habit. But my point is that I have a much deeper interpersonal relationship and connection and emotional connection with you guys that I did not have at that time. But the moment that I knew that you guys were committed and seeking, it didn't matter that we probably weren't on the same page with certain beliefs. I knew your hearts and your connection, that you loved God and you were seeking. I had agape love for you from that point forward. The phileo has developed and will continue, hopefully.